Hello gang, Tattooed Biker here with you. And tonight I've got 4 true stories and reports of encounters with, well, what I consider unidentified cryptids. That being creatures or beings that weren't either seen clearly or maybe just don't fall into the usual categories. 2 reports deal with what are assumed to be skinwalkers, but my personal knowledge of that lore is too limited to make a definite call on that. I would love to hear your theories on all these reports, as I'm sure the submitters are looking for answers, but please, keep the comments respectful. Remember, it takes a lot of courage to share personal experiences with the unexplained. So now, if you're ready, grab your gear and let's ride. Number 1. Dear Biker, my father is Navajo, who was raised on the res in northern Arizona. My mom is white. She was actually raised in western Canada. I grew up in southern California, but grew up going to the res every year to visit family. I eventually moved and worked there. I'm not a skinwalker expert by any means, but I'll share what I know. The earliest experience that I had was on one of my first solo trips, without my parents, out to our ranch on the reservation. I traveled with my cousin and a few friends. Our ranch is pretty much in the middle of nowhere. The nearest people, being at the very closest, are at least 10 miles away, so you're pretty much on your own. On our first night there, we arrived around 2 a.m. and there was no moon and it was pitch black. We had a hard time finding our hogan, a traditional octagon-shaped Navajo house. We decided to just camp near a cattle corral, which we found. We set up tents and knocked out until the sun came up. When I awoke, I took a little walk around the campsite and found coyote tracks, which encircled the camp and actually got pretty close to the tents and campfire, which was pretty weird and a bad sign for several reasons. The rest of the day went without incident. We woke up, cooked breakfast, explored the north rim of the Grand Canyon on the reservation side, and checked out old hogans in the area. We stayed up pretty late that night. We had been out exploring at night and four-wheeling on some off-road trails. It was around 2 or 3 a.m., and we were driving up on a rocky road that went into a small canyon, so there were hillsides that were pretty high and steep on both sides of me. I was standing in the back of the truck with a spotlight, and that was when I first saw the light. The best way to describe what I saw was the visual effect of when you're standing in a room and someone behind you takes a picture with a flash. There was this brief instant in which everything lit up behind me, but it was a dull and orange-reddish light. I turned around towards where it came from and shined the light around, but there was nothing there whatsoever, just a bunch of rocks. We all thought it was weird, but kept driving nonetheless. Once, on top of the hill, we stopped to look around and noticed the weird light again, but this time, it was far away, at least several miles. It was the same color, but it looked like a muzzle flash from a gun. I waited and waited to hear the gunshot, thinking it was people like us out shooting at night, but it never came. Then we saw another flash, but this time it was several miles to the west and a little bit closer. And then another and another, each one closer than the last, all within a few minutes. We decided it was all just too weird and, without talking about it, turned around and went to the hogan this time. We didn't really talk about the lights for some reason, and we all settled down in the hogan. There was myself, my cousin, and my 2 white friends. We talked for a while, and it was that moment when everyone stopped talking, and everyone was just about to fall asleep when it happened. The door, there's only one, shook violently, as if someone had kicked it as hard as they could. It was loud and strong enough to where you could hear the lock rattle and the door bounce and rattle against the wooden frame. My friends shot up in bed and said, "What was that?" They had real reason to be alarmed. We were pretty far from anyone else, and they knew that. It's extremely quiet out there. Pretty much almost a deafening silence, and you can hear when vehicles are approaching. I jumped out of bed, grabbed a shotgun, and told my cousin to get his rifle. I walked over to the door and motioned for him to come over, and said, "You go left, I'll go right." I'm not really sure why, but I wasn't scared, despite the obvious weirdness of what was going on. I ripped the door open, and we both slipped out the door, one after the other, and swept the area. We looked everywhere we could, went to the truck and got the spotlight even, and swept the area. Nothing. No footprints, no animals, no nothing. We decided to send a message and shot some rounds off to scare whatever it was away. I think we were all kind of worried, but eventually we went back into the Hogan and settled back in, even kind of joking about it to calm our nerves. Eventually they all fell asleep, but I hid my nervousness and my heart was still racing. It wasn't until everyone was quiet and asleep that I noticed the thumping. I heard it very faintly through the rock walls, and when I put my ear to the wall, I heard it a lot better. It was a very rhythmic, thumping sound, something very heavy and keeping perfect time. It sounded like it was coming through the rock table that the Hogan sits on top of. I kept trying to rationalize it and told myself that it was just the cows, and somehow managed to fall asleep. I awoke the next morning and we went to check the cows, which were about 10 miles away on the ranch and hadn't been anywhere near our Hogan that night. Several days later, after I told my aunts about what happened, they told me that one of my Navajo grandmas who lived alone and out in the middle of nowhere had a weird thing happen too. The same night that we had our door kicked, someone had knocked on her door in the middle of the night. When she opened it, there was no one there. My aunts think it was a skinwalker who was messing with me and my cousin because we're mixed race. Now, I'm not sure if that's the reason why it happened, but I do believe it may have been a skinwalker. Thanks for reading. Signed, Reed. Number 2. Dear TB, something saved my life on Cocoa Beach, Florida, on Easter Sunday of 1994, and no human stepped forward and claimed it. Something brought me in from the water, and seemingly no one else even saw the incident. It was actually a school trip, coming from Kentucky and headed to a 3-day sea camp on Big Pine Key. Roughly halfway between is Cocoa Beach, Florida, where we stopped the first night and spent the next day playing on the beach before continuing our journey. I was 14, and this would be my first time ever seeing a body of water large enough that it ended on the horizon. So there were a bunch of teenagers, all 12 to 15 of us, walking out into the ocean and jumping into the waves. It was fun, but I wasn't used to it. I had only played in creeks by this point in my life, and they don't have waves or current. When you do find a swimming hole in a creek, the first goal is to go out as far as you can until your head doesn't go under. From there, playing is just a series of swimming back and forth to the spot where your feet could still touch. With all my classmates stopping at waist deep to play in this ocean, I thought I could impress them by walking out further. I started walking. I had to stay focused to keep my footing when the waves would come, but I was determined to make it until the water touched my chin, while my feet was touching the ground. And I did. Sure, it only hit both spots in between waves, but I'm pretty sure I'd made it that far. I turned around to make sure my friends could see me and be impressed, expecting to find a line of them following me, but there was no one behind me. My friends seemed to be the size of ants, still back at waist-deep water, and no one had noticed how far out I'd gone. I started to panic and walk back, but my feet couldn't find the ground. I was trying to swim, but the waves kept coming, and the harder I tried, the further out I went. I kept trying to scream help, but every time my head was out of water and I opened my mouth, all I got was a mouthful of water, and it would drag me further out and even further under. I never even got to scream for help the whole time. And the next thing I remember is feeling an arm around my body and the rush of water against me as I'm being pulled to shore. I believe I was in and out of consciousness during this time because the memory is kind of dodgy. I remember a glimpse of blonde hair in the water, but to be honest, I have blonde hair, so it could have been mine. However, something also made me feel like whatever this was, it was a female whose arm was around me. Next, I remember being dropped face down onto the sand, and I immediately began vomiting up tons of water. Once I had gotten settled and realized that I could and was breathing air, I turned around to thank whoever this was, and there was no one there. Nobody was there to see if this 14-year-old kid was going to stop puking up ocean water and breathing through her lungs again. The beachgoers around the area weren't even looking at me. No one was coming to check my vitals. The teachers and the other students were further down the beach, and none of them even looked my way. I made it back to my crowd and decided that I wouldn't say anything. To be honest, I was a little embarrassed, and I also had a fear that if the teachers found out that I'd almost drowned, then they would call my mom and she would demand that I come home, and then the whole trip would be scrapped. So I said nothing, and no one ever said anything to me. I just wanted to share this with someone. Signed, Melissa. Number 3. Hey, Tattooed. This happened to my older brother, who we can call Danny here. It was back in the early 2000s, and he was a senior in high school in a small, podunk Utah town. Being a senior and a football player, he was kind of an idiot and did stupid things. One of which included walking through the woods late at night to, as he called it, throw rocks and terrorize kids from school. Yes, immature I know, but he and his accomplice, another Navajo called Joe, were seniors on the football team. And they walked through the woods because the cops patrolled the streets, and there was a city curfew in place. The route they took went through a state park, which has lots of Navajo artifacts, and even a kiva, which you can go down into. So one night they were sneaking through the forest before the sun had risen, and they had begun to stop and shush each other, because they could sometimes hear footsteps off in the distance. Unless some other geniuses had the idea to walk through the desert, there should have been no one else out there. This continued for a while until Joe stopped Danny, grabbed him, and said, "Get down." They dropped to their stomachs and hid, listening. Now the footsteps, crunching through the dry desert, were accompanied by mumbling. Danny estimated that the sounds were maybe 100 feet away at first, but kept getting closer. He doesn't know if the mutterings were Navajo or English or some other language. After a while, all the noises staying fairly far away, Joe whispered without looking, "It sounds like a drunk." After a few more minutes, Danny decided to chance a peek as the drunk sounded more distant now. It was night, but the moon was bright and the light bounced off the canyon wall nearby. Danny was looking for a man, but instead he saw a figure which he said moved with a tilt to its body, and it was long and tall. It was basically human-formed and walking on 2 feet, but misshapen and very, very tall. He said it maybe resembled a Kokopelli or Navajo Cachadal, but not so exactly normal-shaped. It mumbled and drifted through the trees, seemingly looking for something. He was captivated, watching it for a few minutes, and then suddenly, the snapping twigs and the mutterings just stopped. Everything went quiet, and the figure, whatever it was, had just disappeared. After that, Danny and Joe both felt that whatever it was in the forest that night was gone. They just sat on the ground afterwards, discussing what had just happened. Joe asked about what Danny had seen, and then stated, I didn't look because if I had, then it would have known we were both staring. I forgot to ask him if he and Joe went back through the woods, but the answer is probably yes. This sort of thing is pretty common within the Navajo culture, and it's something that they're used to dealing with. Thanks for reading. Signed, Anonymous. Number 4. Hey TB, this is an experience that happened when I was a kid, probably 8 to 10 years old. I'm 22 now, for reference. You see, there used to be this park in the summers that my dad would take me to. He would play basketball in the section where the courts were, and I would play in the section with the park equipment. One day, I was on a swing set, and this couple just came up and started talking to me. There was a man and a woman with a black stroller. I don't think I ever saw a baby in that stroller. I remember it always being faced away from me. This may have been a normal interaction and eventually interactions, but something just felt very off or like dreamlike about the encounters. I was even able to pick up on it at that age. The man in the couple was wearing blue jeans and a red and white plaid checkered shirt, but he looked really odd, like very clammy, pale, or even grayish. I also remember his eyes being extremely penetrating. The woman had on a dress and medium-length brown hair. And for some reason, I just can't remember her face, no matter how hard I try. She looked more normal than he did from what I remember. The best way to describe the man's hair would be kind of ashen blonde and artificial looking. Kind of sticky up lots of flyaways, and in sort of a bowl cut style. I can't remember exactly what we talked about, but I think it revolved around God and religion, and it was a fairly short interaction, probably only around 10 minutes. The weirdest part is that I saw them later at a completely different park at a different date. It may have been weeks or months, and they were in exactly the same outfits, with the exact same stroller. It looked like only 5 minutes had passed since the last time I seen them, but it was a completely different location on a different day. I can remember feeling apprehensive and very off and scared when I saw them again. Strangely, I can't remember if I talked to them that time or not. And the last key to the story is that when I told my dad about seeing this couple multiple times as a kid, he said that maybe they were angels. And I remember that intensely freaking me out for some reason, I guess, because it just didn't feel right to me, like it was completely wrong to call them that. Now, there could be a perfectly rational explanation for all this, but more recently, I've been doing more spiritual work and growth as well as scientific research, and this memory resurfacing prompted me to share it. It's not the first time I recalled this happening, but it is the first time that I feel like I could maybe get some sort of explanation or theories. I'd be happy to provide more context about my life if it's helpful, or the encounters if I can remember anything else. Thanks. Signed, Jeffrey. Number 5. Dear Biker, I lived in Montana on some land that my dad owns, and I was hiking up a mountain, Bighorn Mountain Range, like most days, and I heard this really weird screaming coming from the other side of the mountain, away from my house and deeper into the woods. It wasn't a mountain lion, too deep and long. It went on for about 10 seconds, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't a bear. It kind of sounded like a human, except it was distorted somehow, almost like someone was possessed by something, sort of like what you would hear in a horror movie. I got to the top of the mountain, pulled out my binoculars, and I looked in the general direction that I'd heard the scream. I saw this weird, humanoid-looking creature. It was as pale as paper, didn't have any hair or clothes or genitals, and its arms were actually longer than its body. It also had these huge black eyes that covered most of its face. It was walking, but as soon as I saw it, it stopped and stared back at me. I watched it carefully for at least 2 minutes, and I remember thinking, it's staring right into my soul. I had to look away because my eyes had actually started watering from not blinking. When I looked back at it after wiping my eyes, it was just gone. I couldn't see it anywhere, which made me think it was maybe a weird hallucination or something. Illusion or not, I decided to get the hell away from the area and ran all the way back home. The scariest part is, 5 minutes after that I walk in the door, I hear that scream again. It was much closer, and it actually made my ears ring. Now that I think about it, I remember that I could hear my dad yell at me whenever he needed help with something every other time that I was up there. I'm pretty sure it was where I was standing when I first saw it. My dad heard it too, so I know it wasn't my imagination, and my neighbor was talking about the screams a week after it happened. I've researched it as best as I could, but I never found anything fitting its exact description. I've never seen it since, only that one time, and my dad hasn't either. It's one of the many reasons that I moved in with my mom in Arizona. Thanks. Signed, Sonny. And there it is. All I have for tonight. 5 strange reports of unidentified beings and cryptids. So what were your thoughts about these encounters? What do you think they were? Well, anyways, I sure appreciate you riding with me tonight, and if you have an encounter or sighting to share, just send it to the email in the description and your story may just wind up in a future video. So thanks again, and until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker, out.